Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Betty Chen. In early July, a Taiwanese fishing boat was seized by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. The Penghu-registered fishing boat Kinmen 88 was forcibly boarded and inspected by the Chinese Coast Guard off the coast of Kinmen. The crew was taken to Weitou Port in Fujian. Taiwan's Coast Guard administration held a press conference stating that the Penghu-registered fishing boat had entered Chinese territorial waters, being 11.2 nautical miles from Jinjiang, China. However, the fisheries agency argued that the fishers were unaware of the boundaries of their fishing area. What impact will this incident have on the already tense situation in the Taiwan Strait? Joining us today are Miles Yu, director of the Hudson Institute's China Center. And also we have Mr. Huang Kwei-bo, National Chengchi University Professor of Diplomacy, and Vincent Zhao, Taipei City Councilor from DPP. A warm welcome to all of you on the show. This year, the Chinese Coast Guard has conducted multiple maritime enforcement operations in the Diaoyutai Islands and the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, demonstrating a notable shift in the nature and the objectives of their missions. Compared to the past, these actions appear to be more targeted and widespread. So let's start with today's conversation. Director Yu, regarding the recent enforcement actions by the Chinese Coast Guard, what are your thoughts on this incident and how do you perceive China's approach to maritime power expansion?
Well, if I were a person from the Philippines, from Japan, South Korea, I would say, welcome to the club, because this is not an incident just the director of Taiwan. It has been there have been many similar incidents regarding to the citizens and fishermen of those countries. So that's number one. Number two, I thought it's very, very peculiar that the reason that the Chinese authorities detained these Taiwanese fishermen is using the 12-mile sovereign water as the basis for detaining him or this fisherman. So that means that by implication that it treats Taiwan as a sovereign country. So in a way, it's very peculiar. So I'm looking forward to see how the Chinese government would interpret this kind of incident from a judicial point of view.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, this also shows the expansion of China's maritime power in addition to its existing power?
Well, China's maritime claim is massive. So I don't think China needs to really use this narrow body of water as an addition to the water is already claimed. I think China probably would be worried more about how the international law would apply in this case, how they can justify the detention of this fisherman from the point of view of international court and international conscience for that matter. So because there are established cases and incidents that govern this kind of incidents. So I'm looking forward to see how this will evolve.
Do you think that China would comply with the international law?
No, but China needs to pretend to comply with international law. Of course, international law interpreted by China. And in many cases, law or not, if they don't think the law applies to them, they just ignore it. Like the case in the case of Philippine and Chinese arbitration case over the South China Sea island. China simply refused to participate in the procedure and basically insist on Chinese law or international laws. So that's basically the Chinese way of expressing its imperious hubris.
Thank you. So going back to the incident itself, Taiwan's Coast Guard administration has also stated that the Penghu fishing boat was indeed operating in the Chinese waters, but Taiwan's fisheries agency believed that the boundaries were not too clear. And this also caused, because of the actions from China's Coast Guard, this action has caused increased cross-strait tensions. So Professor Huang, what's your perspective on this matter? And what are your suggestions for Taiwan to handle such kind of situation if similar events happen in the future?
I think we have to know some of the basic facts. First, I think the vessel you just mentioned did leave out of the restricted or forbidden waters proclaimed by the ROC government. And second, I think that the boundary for Taiwan's fishermen to be able to operate in those disputed areas is not that clear. So I would say there is some tacit understanding over where the line is or whether or not the line exists. And second, the PRC government does claim that there was a 12 nautical mile territorial water, and the Taiwanese vessel did step into that territorial water claim by Beijing. And fourth, the Taiwanese vessel went into that disputed water when the PRC announced now there is a fishing off session. So, I think in total that caused this very unfortunate incident that the mainland Chinese Coast Guard tried to seize our vessel, and it did, and which led to some disputes nowadays. And for Taiwan, I do think Taiwan doesn't have too many choices in terms of dealing with this kind of looming urgencies or crisis, because one of the ways the Taiwanese government can do is laissez-faire. I just let my fishermen go there, continue to fish. Okay, do whatever you want to do. But if you get caught, sorry for that. I don't think that's a very responsible attitude for Taiwan. And second, Taiwan needs to negotiate with Beijing. But given these very sour cross-strait relationships, I do not think negotiation is now a viable way for Taiwan to solve this problem. And a third possible way for Taiwan is to continue to enhance its deterrence capability by putting more and more Coast Guard forces in those dispute areas. But we know that the mainland Chinese Coast Guard seems more formidable and they are more stronger. So I do not think that enhancing Taiwan's deterrence capability would work. So my conclusion is, I think Taiwan needs to find a way, at least for the welfare of the fishermen on the both sides. The two local authorities needs to meet and to find out something workable, so that neither sides would feel worried about being caught by one of the authorities.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on, Vincent, how do you see the evolving role of the Chinese Coast Guard and Beijing's strategy towards Taiwan? And also, following what Professor Huang said, negotiation seems to be something necessary. And also in President Lai's inaugural address, he also expressed the willingness to have further communication. What's your take on this?
Well, let me start with the second and go on to the first. So first of all, like Professor Huang said, there are a lot of facts on the ground today that we see concerning this case that are out there. The first one is that, yes, this fishing vessel was operating within the 12-mile limit of China's territorial waters. Yes, it was operating in an area that the Chinese had previously announced would not be open for fishing this season. And that it did leave, I guess, the relative safety of areas that are more seen as under ROC jurisdiction in the Taiwan Strait. So in that sense, I think, at least from a legal perspective, I do think that the Chinese Coast Guard had a prerogative, and I think was within their reasoning in terms of taking this vessel in. With that being said, however, I think there are political connotations that also arise outside of just the legal sphere. So the second part is that I do think the Chinese see this as an opportunity. Maybe an opportunity that just came up and they were not previously aware of, but nevertheless an opportunity to send a warning signal, not only to Chinese fishing vessels, but also to the broader, to Taiwan and broader international community, that it will crack down through its Coast Guard vessels on any infringements on their sovereignty or any infringements on their legal framework. So I think it does send a very hardline message, not only to Taiwan, but also to Japan and the Philippines. The third observation I would have in this specific case would be, it has created a lot of domestic pressure here in Taiwan for this administration. Professor Huang, I think, pointed out a perspective that many people within the KMT would have, which would be that, yes, it is necessary for the two sides to be able to sit down and work these things out. We have to be clear. These incidents have taken place in the past. It's not the first one. There's been over a dozen such cases, I think, since 2013, of Chinese Coast Guard vessels taking our fishing vessels back to port. Most were released within 48 hours after paying a relevant fine. But this issue may be used for further political gain by the PRC. And so far, we have not seen any sign that the PRC is about to release these fishermen, either through paying a fine or through other legal mechanisms. But I think holistically, there is a broader problem happening, which is that, number one, China's Coast Guard is getting much, much stronger. Number two, it's further militarized. It's no longer seen as just a law enforcement agency. And number three, they're willing to use it to address claims ranging from the South China Sea all the way to the Taiwan Strait. So just a bit of history. So, I mean, the Chinese Coast Guard was formed in 2013 out of the People's Armed Police. So it was a paramilitary organization. But since then, it has been placed under the Central Military Commission. So it's under the same military structure as the PLA. It's headed by PLA and Navy officers. Its tonnage has grown tremendously. They're at 500 ships right now, 40,000 people. Their largest Coast Guard vessel is about 12,000 tons, which is about 3 times the size of your mainland U.S. Coast Guard vessel. So I do think the militarization of their Coast Guard has very worrying connotations, not only for Taiwan, but the wider Indo-Pacific region, and countries, I think, need to take a cold, hard look at how they can, I would say, respond to the growth and urgency of the Chinese Coast Guard in the future.
Thank you, Vincent, for sharing with us the information. Taiwan's Coast Guard Administration has also reports that China's Coast Guard Order Number 3, which took effect on June 15th, has led to aggressive enforcement actions during the fishing moratorium. So far, 138 foreign fishing vessels have been driven away, 14 boarded and inspected, and 1 detained. These assertive measures have impacted not only Taiwan, but also neighboring countries such as Japan and the Philippines, escalating regional tensions. So now going back to what we have discussed, Professor Huang, we have talked about the growing operations of the Chinese Coast Guard in these disputed islands. So what are Beijing's intentions, and what kind of challenge does it pose to maritime security in East and Southeast Asia?
Okay, first of all, I would like to say that it is really unusual for the Beijing authorities to detain or seize Taiwanese vessels. In the past 20 years, if my recollection serves me correctly, the Beijing authorities only capture, I would say, perhaps some 40 or 50 Taiwan vessels, or even fewer. Okay, but to the contrast, the Taiwan side actually seized more than 10,000 mainland Chinese vessels. But I would say more than 10,000 vessels seized were during the Ma Ying-jeou period. And the DPP period only seized like less than 100. So I think it doesn't matter whether or not there is a Coast Guard Order Number 3 or what kind of legal measures the Taiwan side has undertaken. But as long as one of the authorities considered these vessels were against my law, they intruded my territories illegally, then I think the Coast Guard would be able to take some assertive actions against these intruding vessels. And for the Coast Guard Order Number 3, I think it would serve as a warning sign for the neighboring countries, because the Coast Guard Order Number 3 says that so long as these vessels intrude the Chinese waters illegally, then the vessels themselves, the articles on the vessels in relation to national security concerns, and the foreigners could be detained or kept by the related authorities by the mainland China. With these more exact or more detailed legal procedures, then we saw this very unfortunate June 17th, the PRC, the Philippines collision over the second Thomas Shoal on June 17th. Also, right after that, around Diaoyu Tai, commonly known as Senkaku by Japanese, Diaoyu Tai, we have seen the Coast Guard and their patrol vessels appeared in these neighboring waters. And in the meantime, the PRC authorities also said that the PRC would like to exercise its sovereign claim and legal powers to prevent foreign vessels from entering these neighboring waters of Diaoyu Tai. So to me, I think that's a reaffirmation of the PRC's legal claim over these disputed waters. So I wouldn't feel surprised in the near future if I see the Beijing authorities said that Beijing would like to exercise more necessary controls over these waters, or Beijing would like to give some warning or expulsions of these foreign vessels. I think that's something Beijing authorities are going to do in order to legally maintain its claim or control over these waters.
Thank you, Professor. Moving on to what we have talked about, the Coast Guard Order number 3. So, Director Yu, what do you think of this issuance at this timing? And do you think that this Order number 3 will reinforce China's maritime sovereignty? And also, in the face of China's legal warfare, how should Taiwan and the neighboring countries respond?
China basically, the number issuing the Order number 3 is not a really big issue. The bigger issue really is the jurisdiction. Whether China has a jurisdiction to enforce whatever measure you might adopt. If the Chinese claim of a maritime jurisdiction is legitimate, you can basically legally use whatever methods you may want, as long as it is in accordance to international law. So that's not the issue. So this Coast Guard issue number 3, Order number 3 does not surprise me. What surprises me is China is now using more of the law enforcement as a way of legitimizing its maritime claim rather than outright military conquest, which will, of course, invoke a much stronger international reaction. So this is not necessarily like a boiling frog strategy. It's pretty close. Use the guise of legality to conduct the illegal territorial expansion. That's number one. The other issue really is about the issue of reciprocity. I mean, both my fellow panelists mentioned this enormous number of Chinese illegal fishing in other people's territorial waters, particularly EEZs. So there should be a comprehensive international system to deal with this rampant Chinese illegal fishing in other people's EEZs, as far as in the Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, in addition to the Pacific Ocean.
So talking about this kind of detention or illegal, you can say boarding or inspection, in the past, the Chinese Coast Guard only held these vessels, like what you said, Vincent, 48 hours. But now they can keep the vessels for 2 to 3 months. So what are the long-term implications of such kind of enforcement actions by China?
Well, I tend to think these enforcement actions are mainly targeted against the Philippines and the South China Sea. I mean, we have to be clear, in this specific case that we've been talking about, this fishing boat here off the coast of Kinmen, or Xinjiang, the case, they didn't actually use an infringement on their sovereignty, because by doing so, they would have admitted that Taiwan is an independent country. And instead, they had used a violation of the moratorium on fishing at the time, as well as, I think, some equipment that was not within, I think, their legal restrictions. So I think they've been very careful to avoid giving any semblance of sovereignty to this issue with Taiwan. But I do think this idea, like Miles said, it's an expansion of the Chinese use of lawfare. So, I mean, we're looking at this everywhere, essentially. We're looking at it through the lens of economic lawfare, through lawfare against Taiwan's international participation, namely through the further, I think, justification under so-called UN Resolution 1758, and how they believe that this imposes a one China principle on all UN members, which it doesn't. But here, specifically in this case, what I think this Coast Guard Order 3 does is it's supposed to send the Philippines a signal that they're ready and prepared, and they're not backing down. And they're clearly trying to define this as a law enforcement action, because to do so otherwise, I think, would put the United States in some pressure to respond, given their long-standing mutual military assistance treaty with the Philippines. So by defining this as a law enforcement action, and by broadening the powers given to the law enforcement branch, namely the Coast Guard, I think what the Chinese are trying to do is to show the Philippines that, we're ready and prepared to press our claims in the South China Sea. Test us. And I think that is going to have implications that are outside of their control. So, for example, they may see this as one way to assertively be able to, I think, consolidate control over their claims. But the truth is, it's driving the Philippines firmly into the camp of the United States, and that has implications for the Taiwan Strait security as well. So I do think that the Chinese should think and look carefully about the implications that these Coast Guard orders are having, not only on Taiwan's neighbors, but also on countries like the United States that do see lawfare as a serious and pressing issue.
Thank you, Vincent. Shifting from maritime disputes to the current situation in the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan has faced frequent incursions by Chinese military aircraft since May 20th, with as many as 30 aircraft often operating around the island. So, Director Yu, you serve as the chief advisor on China policy to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and given now, former President Trump is doing very well in the polls, so it seems that he has very good chance of returning back to the White House. And also, you have previously said that if Trump returns to power, the U.S. policy towards China would remain unchanged, and with China still being the top threat to the United States. And Trump would definitely consider using more restrictive measures to ensure Beijing commits to not using force against Taiwan. Will this lead to any changes in the current tense cross-strait relations? Director Yu.
I think the whole world is watching what the election result will be. It's natural. I would say this specifically to answer your question. In the last two administrations, United States-China policy showed very different path and methodologies as well from the previous several decades. That policy has gained enough support from both parties. We can definitely say there is a national consensus on China. If you use the word consensus in U.S. politics, which is very, very rare, and this is the issue that will transcend the party exigencies and partisan bickerings. So it is a national consensus, and having said that, there will be, so in other words, both President Trump and President Biden, no matter who wins, and which right now looks likely President Trump might win again, will remain unchanged because this is a national consensus. Basically, the current path of the new China policy was set by President Trump and Secretary Mike Pompeo. So during his administration, who did this. So, and it's very unlikely to change that path at all. Number two, there is a very big difference here. That is, the Trump administration, version 2, would definitely stress more deterrence. The fact is that during the past 3+ years, the cross-strait tensions, the overall tensions in the South China Sea, in the whole region caused by China, have increased dramatically. That basically, in my view, should be considered as a failure of deterrence. Because during the Trump administration, the deterrence was very strong, and China basically maintained quiet. There was no overreaction after any American politicians visit to Taiwan, even at the cabinet level. And there was no South Koreans behaving badly because President Trump stressed very, very strongly on deterrence to make the troublemakers know the cost of their misbehavior. So I would say that actually would be a very different. While the Democrats, President Biden probably will continue this, I would say, fool's errands and basically try to compete with China, but also trying to ask China for cooperation on some issues that President Biden would like to do. Because the Chinese government basically views every American's request or appeals for cooperation not as the opportunity to solve real problems, but as the opportunity to make a bargain with the United States. So it's very Machiavellian and expedient. That basically has been proven not very effective. I hope the Democrats have learned lessons, but we'll see.
So talking about the possibility of President Trump being re-elected, so how will that be different? You talk about the version 2.0, right? How will China react to the version 2.0 of the Trump administration compared to the first term?
I think China will behave better because they know the consequence of misbehavior will be more costly. And I think, deterrence through strength and deterrence with, listen, this is not all about against China, Chinese government, Chinese people. It's all about follow international law, international norm. And I think it's for China's benefit to behave like a normal country, to basically, to conduct a whole series of policies based upon the laws and the norms that everybody else is following. And I think China is not doing that. Always try to give the world the direction where Chinese government wants everything to go into. They call it 指明方向. So China needs the international world as well, as much as the world needs China. So basically, we need to cooperate with China, but we also should have a very effective methods of deterrence to force the Chinese government to behave. And I think that's probably the right way to go. And I think, history has proven that there's a better way than what is going on right now.
My final quick question. What are your suggestions for Taiwan to navigate through this complicated U.S.-Taiwan-China relationship?
Taiwan is not alone. Taiwan is not the lone victim of Chinese Communist Party. Taiwan fits into a pattern of Chinese aggression in the region. So many of the issues that we're talking about, including the issues today, is not just about Taiwan. The maritime security and
the whole region.
The whole region, the clarity of a definition of each other's claims should be really enforced through negotiation or through conference. China doesn't want to do that. So that's, I think, is the most important thing. Taiwan is not alone. Taiwan is part of the world that's facing the same kind of threat and challenges by China.
Thank you for the message. That's
You're
all
welcome.
the time we have for today. Thank you so much for your insights. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.